welcome to episode number 82, part 1 of our Academy Award special. This is something, Gar, we have been wanting to do for a long time. And, of course, because we're doing this, it's a Sunday. And let's really get into, Gar, what are your memories of the Academy Awards? But I just want to let people know that, the fact that the Academy Awards celebrate its 96th anniversary this year in 2025, there's so much that we could talk about. We're just going to even scratch the surface doing 2 episodes. But in part 1 today, we're going to talk about kind of the general history of Academy Awards and how it got started. So start us off, please, Gar, and share your memories. What are some of your first memories of the Academy Awards, growing up in your lifetime?
Well, as a child, my memories go back, all the way back to the 60s.
Yeah.
And some vague memories of the 50s, but the 60s.
Yeah.
And at that time, I was a young child.
Yeah.
But yet, at the same time, I was aware of the Oscars.
Yeah.
And the thing that got my attention was, it was constantly implied that it was the Oscars was such a big deal because of what it actually stood for.
Yeah.
Which was acknowledging incredible performances, giving actors and actresses, their due acknowledgement for those incredible performances.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's what it was implied at that time when I was a kid. And so when I'm watching it, the actual performances used to live up to, why they were nominated for these awards.
Yeah.
And back in those days, I never really questioned it because whenever you saw the movies or whenever you saw the performances, you knew that these were Oscar-worthy performances.
Yeah.
And so that was the thing that drew me in was, how big of a deal it was.
Yeah. And let me ask you, Gar, I don't know if you tune in every year to watch the Academy Awards still or not, but every year they have what's considered like a red carpet event where before the event, as the celebrities are arriving and people that are nominated for the awards, they're outside the theater, they're being interviewed and asked, about the movie that they're nominated or whatever. A lot of people enjoy tuning in that. How about you?
I for the same reason, because it's so obvious nowadays that the Oscars have morphed away from what it was actually intended to be in the first place.
Yeah.
An awards ceremony, say for example, awards ceremony exists in all aspects of
entertainment,
professional life.
Yeah.
Professional life. People that work for their work get awards.
Yeah.
And those awards still mean what they were intended to be when you receive those awards in the workplace. And in other places, those awards still mean the same thing.
Yeah.
It's an acknowledgement for a great performance in whether it be in your job or as an actor in the entertainment or whatever. But the Oscars have lost that. It has morphed into a promotional vehicle now. And I see people win awards and I see the performance and I go, oh, I don't see anything Oscar-worthy in that performance.
Yeah.
What I used to see which it was very obvious that it was an Oscar-winning performance.
Sure.
And say, for example, to this day, there is a movie that I was introduced to in the workplace because I was in sales at that time, and and I saw a performance by Alec Baldwin that to this day I feel it was an Oscar-winning performance in a movie. It was riveting. It was powerful. It had every single element that you would that originally would be used to consider that performance as an Oscar-worthy performance. I don't even think he was nominated.
Now let me
at that time.
Let me ask you, Gar, here,
He wasn't even nominated.
Yeah.
I watch constantly people winning awards, and I watch the performance, and I'm left flat. It doesn't mean what it used to mean, and that's really sad because now, when I don't think that the Academy, the people that belong to the Academy, I don't think that they realize what they're doing. They are killing their awards.
Yeah.
Because the ratings are consistently going down and down and down and down. And why do you think that is? It is the public rejecting what the Academy Awards has morphed into now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It means nothing what it originally meant.
Yeah, Gar, I think it's for a number of reasons, and I want everybody to know, listening to this episode, Gar and I made a point here when we decided to do this episode that we're not going to really get a whole lot into politics, but I think there's a lot going on with that, Gar, what you were just talking about. I mean, I think, for example, you bring up Alec Baldwin, and he's a great example because I think, right or wrong, a lot of people might be turned off to a guy like that because he's so outspoken. He's maybe people think he's too political.
No. That is completely has no bearing on it.
No, that's what I was getting.
What you're talking about is what he was doing in the 2000s.
No, that's what I was getting ready to.
Hold on.
Yeah.
That performance that I'm talking about happened in the early 90s.
Okay.
Way before any of the other things you're talking about, came, so it has no bearing whatsoever on what I'm talking about.
Okay. Now, the point I was going to make is, not necessarily with Alec Baldwin, but I do think there's people that throughout their career have been kind of a loudmouth to some people. But I think, this is my problem with that, I think if the performance is good, that should have no bearing. You know what I mean? If the performance is Oscar worthy, I think that's all that should matter. And I think also, sadly, you're not going to believe this when I tell you, Gar. I recently heard on a recent newscast just a few days ago that some people that are that nominate these films and they're part of the Academy admitted to the fact that they don't even watch some of these movies. And when you're part of the Academy and you get to nominate these films for Oscars and stuff, they send you copies of the film. So, when I hear stuff like that, that's just plain laziness, not even taking the time to watch the movie. So how can you fairly decide if it's Oscar worthy or not,
Well, that is something that, I don't really know anything about because I haven't seen anything that really verifies that.
Yeah.
But to me that sounds more like an opinion, and that's rightly so because this is a pop culture
show,
thing, and you can't have a pop culture show without opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, so in all fairness,
mm-hmm.
But the truth of the matter is for people that have opinions that direct their likes and dislikes in one way, and then other people have other opinions.
Yeah.
That have likes and dislikes that go in other ways. Those eventually wind up evening out.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Simply because those likes and dislikes change over time. With societal change. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And what is acceptable at one time, in a matter of a very short amount of time, can morph into something that is completely unacceptable.
Sure.
And so society changes, constantly. And with those societal changes, directly influence what those pop culture changes are going to be.
Sure.
And so I put it more in the things wind up taking their own course organically.
Yeah.
When you're talking about social opinions that change over decades.
Sure.
Because what was socially acceptable at one time might be completely. Here's an example, and this goes exactly to what I'm talking about in relation to the Oscars. Because there was a time that Betty Davis was elected president of the Academy Awards. She was elected president.
Wow.
And I believe this is like the 1940s when this happened. And so she looked at it as any other presidential nomination.
Sure.
That now you can, if you decide that there needs to be some changes that need to happen. She felt that she was given the position to spearhead those changes.
Yeah.
Now, the changes that she proposed at that time were viewed by, of course, it's all done, male, as radical. And, just going too far and everything. And so they told her that, yes, you were elected president of the Academy Awards, but because you're a female, we gave it to you as a figurehead. Not as a real president. And so they completely rejected all of her proposals. There were only 3, and so she realized that this was the case, and she was extremely frustrated because of how she was subjugated in trying to implement those changes, and so she quit. She resigned. Now here is the kicker. A year later. It only took a year. And those changes were implemented. These radical, you're going too far.
Wow.
And all of those things. And only a year later, those same changes occurred.
Wow.
What does that tell you about how society was back in the 1940s compared to how society is now?
Oh, yeah.
That is a dramatic difference.
Yeah, and Gar, I was reading that the Academy Awards, of course, are held each year for artistic and technical merit in the film industry. The Academy Award is considered to be the most prestigious award in the film industry. So if you work in the film industry, you're an actor, a director, a writer, and you're somehow connected to the movie industry, that's the gold standard. That's what every person in the film industry hopes to one day achieve. Of course, there's other awards out there, but just think about this. If you worked in the film industry up until that point, you were doing it for money, you're getting paid. But I mean, the first time, can you imagine the very first time they held the Academy Awards for people working in the film industry, what a great feeling of acknowledgement that finally was. Is wow, my work is being recognized. Wow, think about that.
Well, see, a lot of people don't really think about this, but the Academy Awards the first Academy Awards was in 1929.
Yeah. Huh?
And the changeover from silent films
Yes.
to talkies actually started in 1927.
Wow.
But actually came into full fruition in the late 1920s, 1929.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the Academy Awards actually, there is a relationship between the two. The transition from silent
to talkies,
to now talkies, because once they implemented the elements of being sound in movies, now a performance became more riveting. And actors spreading their wings became much more prevalent at that time. So I think that this is pure speculation on my part, but I think the timeline bears it out that the actual transition into talkies had a lot to do with why the Academy Awards was born in the first place.
Yeah, it would make sense because, Gar, even you may remember that when we did our episode on Felix the Cat, something we discovered was the fact that we didn't even know until doing the episode was that Felix Cat actually dated all the way back to this, I think, 1919, the silent film era when that was still going on. So at that point, Felix the Cat looks very different. He doesn't even have a voice. So you'd be amazed some of the stuff that dates back to the silent movie, time.
Well, it was a very, very different time. And I can see where, during the silent film era, why, performances weren't, there were major stars during the silent film era. Yeah. I mean, big time major stars. But, all of those performances during that time period really weren't considered riveting performances because you didn't have the element of vocabulary being spoken at that time. Yeah. So the performances weren't as riveting.
Yeah.
And it was during the silent film era, it was more about the actual movie in totality, the movie as a whole, rather than recognizing, different performances and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. And now getting a little more specific, exactly, talking about the very first Academy Awards show, as you said, it took place on May 16th, 1929, at the Roosevelt Hotel in Los Angeles, with an audience of 270 people. And I was also reading that it said, compared to today's standards, we're talking about the very first one in 1929. It was not the big spectacle that it is today. Of course, it was even on TV or radio, and so in order to even have anything to do with the Academy Awards, you'd have to get invited. You have to go in person.
Well, and I think that the powers that were in place at that time, I don't think anybody really, it was really thought of as the same kind of award ceremonies that happen in the workplace.
Yeah.
But their workplace was the movie industry.
Sure.
And originally it was intended exactly the way we experience these ceremonies when we're experiencing it in our lives, in the workplace and different things like that.
Yeah.
But at that time, I don't think that the powers in B were, had ever realized that it was going to morph into. But it was undeniable at the time that all of a sudden the public that had all of these people that were their favorite stars, that they enjoy going to the movies and spending their hard-earned cash to go see these movies, were piquing their interest. Who of my favorite stars is going to win this awards? And the powers that be started seeing that there was this interest in the public in these awards that you didn't see in other awards. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, sure.
And so the powers that be were going, oh, this is growing into something much bigger than we ever saw.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
Yeah, and again,
and and that's why when it was in its early years, it totally meant what it was intended to be.
Sure.
Which is totally opposite of what it is now.
I mean, that's the thing. I don't know about you, Gar. When I was doing my research for this, I kind of looked at it from a historical point of view in the sense that what it started out to compared to what it is now. And it's like back in 1929, it obviously was just a spark of an idea. They had no idea of the potential that lied ahead for the Academy Awards 96 years later, as we sit here and talk in the year 2025. But another fun aspect of this historically was, going back from the very first one that took place in 1929, it said in 1930, when the second Academy Awards show was held, that was the very first time it was broadcast on the radio. So again, we're so used to seeing it on TV, you don't even think that there was a time when nobody even had a TV. But when you finally get a chance, all of a sudden have it, in your house, you're hearing it on the radio.
And just like every other thing that people used to gravitate towards the radio for their entertainment at that time, it was the imagination.
Yeah.
When you sat at home and you knew that this was an extravagant gala.
Yeah.
Where it was very wealthy people, and of course. The main population always has a fascination with the ultra wealthy,
sure,
especially the ultra wealthy that is in the entertainment, because they're the most in your face. You know what I mean? Than anything else. So it was. I forgot where I'm going with it. It was the imagination. That's what I was talking about.
I think
the imagination that was occurring at that time, that people, could sit at home and in their minds they would imagine what this thing was like.
Yeah.
And they would take the descriptions from the announcers that were talking on the radio as their fuel for what they would be imagining in their minds.
Yeah, Gar.
So it was a very different time, and there is a elegance and a beauty to why radio was so popular at that time.
Yeah,
very, very similar to what reading a book is like.
Yeah,
and I've never really listened to audiobooks.
Yeah,
but my experience from when I used to read books and stuff like that is that imagination in your mind.
Yeah, and Gar, you make a very good point, because I think a lot of us that are alive today, maybe for a simple fact we weren't alive back then in the 1930s. We really can only imagine what it must have been like. And you made a very good point that, my father told me stories about when he was little that if you had a TV in your house, you were considered, you must be rich. And back in the 1930s, when everybody, not everybody had a radio. Like you said, that's another one of those things that at the time in the 1930s, maybe you'd be considered rich if you had a radio, or maybe if your family couldn't afford a radio and the Academy Awards are going to be broadcast on the radio, you don't have a radio at your home, but maybe you'll go to another family members who does, and the whole family will tune into the Academy Awards that night, Well,
and yes, and it really, it's a thing that existed
back then.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so yeah, you're 100% right.
And then just to kind of, again, to put this in perspective historically, I was reading that in regards to the Academy Awards, it was a big deal when it was broadcast on the radio for the very first time. It said the Academy Awards, though, to put this in perspective, would not be broadcast on television even until 1953.
Well, here's the, just like what you were talking about, the transition from radio to TV. That you weren't considered, if you had a TV, you were considered rich.
Yeah.
Well, the same thing happened in the late 60s. You didn't have a color TV unless you were rich.
There you go. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because most people had black and white TVs.
Yeah. And
the only people that had color TVs, back in the late 60s were the wealthy.
Yeah. And again, I found some fun facts about this. It said when the very first Academy Awards took place, Gar, on May 16th, 1929, there were only 12 awards. The show was over in, get this, 15 minutes. The 12 categories honored at the Academy Awards in 1929 were as followed. Outstanding Picture, Best Unique and Artistic Picture, Best Director for a Dramatic Picture, Best Director for a Comedy Picture, Best Actor, Best Actress, Best Writing for an Original Story, Best Writing Adaptation, Best Art Direction, Best Cinematography, Best Engineering, Best Title Writing. And then another thing was kind of interesting. You see how they had like Best Director for a Dramatic Picture, Best Director for a Comedy. They a few years later changed that into just having one category for Best Director.
And this is, the first?
Yeah, this very first time. So like the very first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, let me tell you what I found out about the first Oscars.
Sure.
That was shocking.
Okay.
It was shocking to me, at least. I can only speak for myself.
Sure.
That first Academy Awards lasted 15 minutes.
Yeah. That's what I just, yeah.
Oh, I didn't catch that.
That's all right. But yeah.
15 minutes.
It was over.
Look at how long it lasts now. It's just
2-3 hours.
Into this big freaking hoopla about, all it is a big freaking commercial.
Yeah.
Trying to get more people to watch blockbusters. That's really what it's morphed into. And the only categories that I personally respect are the independent film awards.
Okay.
Because those seem to still stand for what the Oscars and the Academy Awards originally intended it to be.
Yeah.
And those are the only ones that I really, pay attention to nowadays.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because, a lot of those, independent films, can turn out to be sleepers. You're completely unaware of it and you give it a chance and it turns out to far exceed any expectations that you had, and I love sleepers.
Yeah.
Those. I'm not saying every single one of them,
no.
But those tend to have those sleeper elements to those movies, and which is why I still kind of pay attention to those ones.
Oh, okay. And then I was reading, Gar. This is another fun fact. In 1930, the Best Unique and Artistic Picture Award, try saying that 3 times, okay, was discontinued because the Academy was still figuring out how to put on an award show. And in they also kind of figured that, the audience is kind of confused. They kind of had 2 Best Picture categories, and so the audience tuning in was kind of confused. Well, which one was really the best picture? So they decided to just have one category for Best Picture.
and rightly so, because to divide it between comedies and drama.
Yeah.
If it's Best Picture, it's Best Picture.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's almost like when you divide it up like that, it's almost kind of turning one of the two into the bastard child.
Yeah. It really is. And now I want to get a little more detail about the very first time it was broadcast on the radio. It said the Academy Awards was broadcast live on Los Angeles radio station KHJ, which was part of a CBS radio network, Gar.
KHJ!
Yeah, there you go. Well, the CBS radio network, while the radio broadcast of the Academy Awards on March 5th, 1936, brought the glamour of Hollywood into homes all across the U.S. for the very first time, it said the Academy Awards remained a very low-key event compared to today's standards, but it was because of the radio broadcast that the Academy Awards became much more popular.
Good old KHJ Channel 9.
Yeah,
I have not forgotten KHJ, and thankful to them for having that maverick, to spearhead bringing the first Academy Awards to television.
Yeah. And it said it was George Giselle, who was born on April 3rd, 1898 in New York, who was nicknamed the Toastmaster General of the United States, who was a comedian, singer, showbiz personality, whose career, Gar, spanned vaudeville, Broadway, Hollywood, and radio, and even the silent film era. He hosted the very first radio broadcast of the Academy Awards show on March 5th, 1936. And again, it's interesting that we're able to research this stuff and find it out. I mean, not only did I want to know, Gar, about the first time it was broadcast on the radio, but I'm wondering to myself, who the hell must have, hosted that? And George Giselle, I have no idea who this guy was, but he sounds like a pretty interesting cat. It said George Giselle starred in the original stage version of The Jazz Singer in 1925. Giselle was originally considered for the 1927 movie version of The Jazz Singer. That role ultimately went to Al Jolson because Giselle turned the role down over a salary dispute, which just might have cost him his place in cinematic history. Let's think about that and how ironic. He's the one that hosts the very first radio broadcast of the Academy Awards.
Well, everybody makes their decision, and nobody has a crystal ball.
Yeah.
So chalk it up to the guy not having a crystal ball.
Yeah, there you go.
The potential of that opportunity.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I remember that it really it did catapult Al Jolson into
that role,
major stardom.
Yeah.
Because at that time, what Al Jolson was doing that made him so popular at that time was completely acceptable.
Yeah.
At that time, which is completely unacceptable now.
Yeah.
But then again, it's just another one of those examples of how society changes their attitudes towards these things over time, and it's always in constant fluctuation.
Yeah.
And nobody's got a crystal ball, and nobody knows where it's gonna go next.
Yeah,
because it's all decided by society as a whole.
Yeah,
not individual aspects of society, but all of those changes that happen in society, which directly influences pop culture, is all decided by society as a whole.
Yeah, and Gar, as I mentioned earlier, the very first television broadcast was in 1953. I'd like to talk a little specifically about that. Going from it being just broadcast on the radio to now TV. And again, in 1953, television is black and white. So again, it wasn't the big spectacle that it is today. But it said that very first Academy Awards to be televised on TV took place on NBC on March 19th, 1953. And who do you try to take a wild guess at who you think hosted it, Gar?
Oh, God, I have absolutely.
Okay, but this kind of makes sense when I read this. It was hosted by Bob Hope, of all people. This was the 25th Academy Awards, for anybody that's interested. And for the very first TV broadcast, it should be noted, Gar, that there was actually two locations. Bob Hope was at the RKO Pantages Theater in Hollywood, California. And Conrad Nagel helped with the East Coast portion of the show on NBC International Theater in New York. Conrad Nagel was a former silent film actor and an Academy co-founder. So, kind of interesting that not only was this first time it's being televised, that they have a smart idea to, okay, well, we'll have Bob Hope do it in Los Angeles. We'll have another host do it on the East Coast. And the reason I was reading they did that, I mean, it makes for great TV, but it had more to do with money. The fact that some of the celebrities that were going to be awarded that night or were nominated, some of them lived in LA and some of them lived in New York, and so that they wouldn't have to spend money on travel, they would just go to the location where they lived near.
Well, another thing that that I remember from the early televised versions of the Academy Awards, is that because TV was black and white at that time, and everybody that was at home was watching it in black and white because color had not been introduced yet. The outfits by women were dominated by, say, rhinestones and sequins and stuff like that, which you don't see nowadays because that has become a passé thing. But there was a reason why they were doing that, was because it was black and white, and the view on that was it was the glam and the glitter of Tinseltown. Why do they call it Tinseltown? The sparkle and all of that stuff. And so they were, and when you were watching it at home, it really did have that effect that you were watching something that was more spectacular. And that is a thing, an aspect of the Academy Awards that has been lost over time that people don't pay attention to. But, when you were there and you were watching it, and that is my purpose of being on this show, is to bring that to this, is that was an aspect that you saw, in big helpings, on TV, that has been lost over the years. It's lost its glam and glitz. And those two terms, glam and glitz, came from that time period. And you make a very good point, because again, in talking about the transition from it just being broadcast on the radio where you're listening to it, to now you can see it in your living room. Yes, it's in black and white. Yes, it's not the effects weren't as great as they are today, but people were excited. Oh, wow, that's what Bob Hope looks like. Wow, that's what that guy looks like. Oh, look at what he's wearing. And even something like watching the Oscars. Even the stars are glittering.
You
know what I mean? It just had that whole effect that when you watched other awards shows, it didn't have that element. Which was another aspect that was a huge part of the Academy Awards at that time. Because of the effect that it had on the audience that was watching it on TV.
And then I was reading too. It said Bob Hope, who was already a radio and movie star in his own right, became even more associated with the Oscars after this hosting gig. I mean, if you go even throughout our lifetime, Gar, there are several people that have hosted the Oscars more than once. I can think of a handful of people. Jay Leno, I think Whoopi Goldberg, Billy Crystal, And there's been other numbers of people, but like Bob Hope's a great example of that because, oh yeah, Bob Hope did he did such a super job. They should get him again next year, And so a lot of times some of these actors would get a hosting gig hosting the Oscars, and it became a big thing for somebody to even, like, as they say, it's an honor just to be nominated. It's an honor. It's even more of an honor to be asked to host the event,
Well, yeah, and for a long time, to be asked, to be the host of the Academy Awards was the pinnacle,
yeah,
of a feather in any actor or actress's cap.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
It was really, a huge nod by the industry to be asked to host it. It was a huge deal for anyone.
Sure. And then it said that the first TV broadcast of Academy Awards was a massive hit for NBC TV. 34 million people had tuned in to the Academy Awards that night, Gar. That was a huge number considering the U.S. population in 1953 was 160 million. In regards to the Academy Awards being broadcast on TV, the first colorized broadcast would come in 1966.
Yeah, and still, most people in 1966 were still watching it in black and white.
Yeah.
And that's the truth. It might be the first year, but not many people saw it in color. Only the rich.
Yeah, Gar, I don't know how you feel, but when I first approached you about doing an episode on the Academy Awards, but the fact that they've done 96 of them so far to date, I mean, it is rich in history. I mean, and we've done a great example today of talking about what it was like going back to the very first Academy Awards compared to today. I mean, we touched about the very first radio broadcast, very first TV broadcast, very first time it was broadcast in color, and you can kind of picture all those changes. Another thing through my lifetime I really enjoyed about the Academy Awards is, like, I remember even a couple of years ago they had Queen with Adam Lambert performing "We Are the Champions." Now that's something that being a Queen fan, that's something that I remember tuning in for. I remember seeing different people over the years perform on the Academy Awards. So that's another thing about the show that I enjoyed over the years. How about you?
To me, it was all about, the actual awards.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The achievements, because, in my, all the way through the 60s and all the way through the 70s, that's really what it meant. It meant the pinnacle of achievement in that industry.
Yeah.
And it's just, I'm just really saddened, to see what it has morphed into. It is so disingenuous nowadays.
Yeah, I mean,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the powers that be, they are so driven by the graphs and by numbers and by profit margins that they don't care that they're killing the Academy Awards. Really, if they were doing something right, then the Academy Awards would not be going down in popularity.
Yeah, I'd be honest.
It would still be popular because the public would still be embracing it.
Yeah,
but I honestly, to the core of my being, believe that is the reason why the Academy Awards is losing its interest from the public, is because of that disingenuous now. If they look at it, let's take advantage of the exposure we can give and how much more money we can make from these movies by giving movies that are not Oscar worthy, but giving them these nods, and we'll make all kinds more money because people do that.
Yeah.
This movie won this award. Now I got to see what this movie's all about.
Yeah,
And they're totally taking advantage of that.
Yeah.
And it's disingenuous. And now the public sees the movie and they go, what?
Yeah, yeah.
I watched this movie for that?
Yeah.
And it won that award for that?
Yeah.
And that's what's happening.
Yeah.
And they're too blind to see it. They're too blind by profits and by greed. And that is driving the demise of the Oscar. Greed is, I think it is the most, I think greed really, leads to the demise of everything.
Yeah, yeah. It really...
Because once greed becomes the primary factor, it no longer has the substantial factor that actually kept it afloat.
Yeah, yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
It's tearing down the infrastructure that actually holds it all up.
Yeah.
And greed is, you can take this and put it in any aspect of life. When we take any greed, always, it winds up tearing down the infrastructure that holds it up, all in the name of more. We need more. It becomes this monster with an insatiable appetite that will never be fulfilled.
Yeah, yeah.
And we are watching that greed actually fueling the demise of an institution called the Academy Awards.
Yeah, I'm with you, Gar. I don't even tune in anymore. I used to love it. I mean, and so sadly, I think what has happened too, it's become more about people getting up and showboating and talking about their political views.
It's all about profits.
I'd rather be...
all of that showboating and all of that stuff, it's all about profits.
I'd rather be entertained. Rather you talk about the movie you were nominated for. And then finally, I think the other thing is, like you said, years ago, when they would announce every year what the movie, who was nominated for what, I tune in to that every time to list it on the news and be, oh yeah, I saw that movie. I'm going to go see that. Oh yeah, I've heard of that. But half the stuff, like even from you'd think at least from a best picture, it'd be a picture that everybody had heard of. Half the time, stuff gets nominated for the best picture. I've never even heard of the movie. I've never even heard of the actor. It might be a new actor, and that's great and everything.
You never even heard of it, and then you see it and you're disappointed. You're going, what?
Yeah. I think
got an Oscar.
Yeah. And Gar,
you know what I mean?
I think we just touched the surface today. We still got part 2 we're going to do in 2 weeks from now. And when people tune into that, we're going to be talking about, you and I are going to each pick 5 highlights, each of us, from throughout the history of the Academy Awards. And we got 96 years of the Academy Awards to go through, so that'll be fun to see what we each come up with.
Well, let me mention something that I found out in doing the research.
Sure.
That really sparked something for me.
Sure.
I have amassed a gigantic library of extremely popular TV shows and extremely popular movies over the years, going, all the way back and everything like that. And I have so much. I have a hard drive.
Wow.
It's a 2 terabyte hard drive.
Wow.
And 2 terabytes is a lot of gigabytes.
Wow.
We used to consider gigabytes like but terabytes is, an outrageous amount of gigabytes.
Wow.
And so I have almost a full 2 terabytes of movies and TV shows.
Wow.
And there's a movie that I've been kicking around adding to that library. And, there's been numerous times that it's come across and I'm going, and I just never pulled the trigger.
Uh-huh.
But I knew that it was a great movie. And it was from the 1970s. And it was such a popular movie at that time because of the catchphrase that came from the movie, which was, I think, one of the first catchphrases in the history of movies. It was a catchphrase that was called, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not gonna take it anymore."
Oh, wow.
That so many people were repeating that line back in the 1970s because of this movie. And it was a movie that was called Network.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That movie was, like I said, it was extremely popular back in the 1970s, and to this day, I remember the popularity of "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore."
Okay, yeah,
that movie has an Oscar-winning performance that goes down in the history of the shortest Oscar-winning performance in the history of the Academy Awards.
Wow.
And it was a performance by Beatrice Straight. And her Oscar-winning performance lasted only 5 minutes. That's it.
Wow.
5 minutes, and she won an Oscar for that performance.
That says...
Now, what learning that did to me,
yeah,
I have to add that movie to my library now, because I want to see what she put into a 5-minute performance that got her an Oscar.
Wow.
It had to have been riveting. It had to really have hit home for a lot of people, for her to win an Oscar for such a short performance.
Wow. I mean, that kind of reminds me of the probably the most famous scene Meg Ryan did in her career. Of course, I'm talking about Harry Met Sally.
I don't know what that has to do with Oscar worthy.
No, not Oscar worthy, but I'm talking about how I guess a scene that's just a few minutes long could be so not necessarily Oscar worthy, but so memorable. That's one of those scenes that people have been talking about for years. Very much, I guess, like what you're talking about. Network.
Well, but the difference is that had the element of sex to it, which made it controversial.
Yes. Okay, I get you.
And I want to see, because there isn't elements, that I know of, that would be part of that performance that would make it controversial.
Oh, sure. Well, Gar, like I said, we just touched the surface, but this was so much fun to do today, my friend. And people can check this out next Saturday, May 3rd. When it premieres in the morning about 8 a.m. We will be posting a link for that once we have it. But take care, my friend, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks.
I absolutely love doing this show.
Okay, bye-bye.